Thank you very much. And they've all been joking all along that as an academic mine is going to be very dull once they heard that I have slides and I have charts, I have graphs. But I can't help myself. Academics generally can't when they're talking about these things. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, Joe, and thank you very much to you all for staying for the whole evening, and we're pushing on at this stage. I'm standing between you all and your after-dinner drink. I'm going to pick up on the kind of question of kind of what kind of government we have at the moment, and then kind of what should be on the agenda for the future. But I want to start with some kind of just general remarks about politics. And political parties and politicians, find themselves in this bizarre position that their profession and their roles are deeply unpopular. And they're the butt of all kinds of jokes and nobody really trusts them. But they're entirely dependent on being popular to actually do the jobs that they need to do. And the kind of perennial challenge for politicians is to find popular policy positions so that they can persuade people to vote for them. And you see, the unfortunate thing is that voters are myopic. And voters actually, they prefer war today to benefit in the future, and plenty of boring research that we can cite to tell you how true that is. And this leads politicians to promising ever greater benefits that you can have right now, but often at the expense of difficulties into the future. And I think we have to remember that this actually happens on a maximum 5-year cycle in between elections. So everything in the system is geared towards kind of short-term, immediate delivery. And this is kind of the dilemma at the heart of democratic politics. And I think it's very easy for us to fault the government now, the government there in the past, the government into the future. But we have to kind of remember what the fundamental structure of the whole system is. It's easy to remember the kind of halcyon days of kind of good governments in the past, of great leaders making insightful decisions for the future of the country. But the truth is, most of us would be hard put to kind of single out anything more than 4 or 5 critical policy decisions that have actually shaped or altered the course of the state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of evaluating the current Dáil and kind of using that as a kind of a platform to say a little bit about what the next Dáil should or might think about doing. And I want to kind of pick up on this first theme of new politics, because I think one of the reasons that we're here and we're discussing these things is there's a degree of derision for new politics, a sense that it really hasn't delivered. And I think part of the problem is that new politics is actually a combination of a whole raft of Dáil reforms that we had at the end of the last government, at the start of this one, and minority government. So it's 2 different things, and it's hard for us to evaluate one and to isolate the effects until we see these kind of Dáil reforms operating under a coalition or until we have another minority government in the future. And I think in particular, if we look at this kind of question of the minority government, there is a couple of pieces in the papers towards the end of the Dáil term kind of labelling the current government the do-nothing government and the do-nothing Dáil, and they were very critical of the government and of the Dáil in general and from what has been achieved. And I just want to go to some of my boring charts. I've been looking at the number of Dáil sitting days and the acts of the Oireachtas, the business of government and the business of Parliament. And the average number of Dáil sitting days per year since 2004 is 104 days. So the Dáil sits on average 104 days per year. And in 2018, the Dáil sat 106 days. So it's not really a whole pile better, but it's definitely not a whole pile worse than the average over the last 14 or 15 years. And the Dáil sitting days is the blue line. The orange line is the number of acts of the Oireachtas that are passed in each year. And the average number of acts of the Oireachtas passed since 2004 per year is 42. So each year, 42 acts are passed through the Oireachtas. In 2018, there were 42 acts passed through the Oireachtas. So the idea that the Oireachtas is doing less or there is less lawmaking happening is not entirely correct. And when we look at the committees, and we've spent lots of hours in this room in previous years talking about how we need serious Dáil reform and we need more committees and we need them to be doing more work. And some of them haven't entirely covered themselves in glory since the reforms. But what we do see here, though, is that the pattern of committee activity is actually increasing. So the average number of meetings of committees per year is 518 over this period. But in fact, there were 626 committee meetings in 2018. So on an activity front, they're doing about the same, and in the case of committees, they're doing just a little bit better. Now, of course, the substance of what they're engaging with is an entirely different matter, and it's much more subjective, and the analysis is much more difficult to do as a consequence. But we can point to a number of very important pieces of legislation that have gone through in the last 3.5 years. The Brexit bill was a very substantial piece of legislation. Abortion is probably the most intractable political issue that the state has actually had to deal with in the last 40 years. And there was a very significant change that happened last year. And all of that happened in the context of a minority government under this new politics arrangement. And one of the notable things that's changed as well is that backbench TDs from the government party and from the opposition parties have a small but notably better impact on legislation. And you can pick out some highlights. People like Gino Kenny had a very important impact on medical cannabis, Claire Daly on the Coroner's Bill, or Coroner's Act in relation to recording of maternal deaths, Donncha O'Leary in relation to sentencing guidelines. Now, more probably does need to be done, but some of these TDs are having an impact on the policy process in a way that they never would have done in the past. Now, there are problems. There are seriously, I think dodgy is the only word to use, seriously dodgy bills before the Dáil, and the government is using, fairly crudely using a money message to keep a lot of those bills from progressing. But I suppose what I really want to say is that in terms of government, the system actually does work really well in the sense that it's able to adapt to circumstances, and it accommodates the changes in the political dynamics. And some of the criticism is certainly deserved, but the picture is a little bit more nuanced than perhaps we get all the time in kind of the public debates and the public discussions. So just in terms of kind of thinking about what the next government should do, I don't necessarily think that the structure of the next government really matters all that much as to whether it's a coalition government or whether it's close to a majority. I think the system has shown it can adapt to those circumstances. But it's more difficult challenge in terms of what the next government maybe should do and how we actually get that. I want to start by going on to an even more boring topic, which is the programmes for government. And these aren't things that keep most of us awake at night, but the programme from government is actually a very important document because it's populated by the manifestos of the political parties. But more importantly, there's lots of research to show that things that get into the programme for government have actually the best chance of actually getting completed and getting achieved. And there's concrete research from all over the world, but specifically also relating to Ireland, done by one of my political science colleagues at UL, Rory Costello, which shows that a majority of pledges and promises that get into the programme for government actually do get delivered and do get achieved. And as a consequence, one of the things we need to be looking at in terms of what the shape and what the policy direction of the next government is really going to be the tedious detail of the party manifestos. And particularly where there is consensus on particular items, it's much more likely that it's going to get into the programme for government, and it's much more likely to actually be achieved if the minister in charge of that policy area is from a party that had it in their manifesto in the first place. And the other thing we know about programmes of government is dull and long is the description. They're getting much longer and much more detailed over the years. The programme for government between Fine Gael and the Independents is running well over 160 pages. And then moving on in terms of what should the next government actually do whenever that comes in, I just want to highlight three particular things, and I want to move away from kind of the albatross of the health system and the housing problems, because we all know about those. But three that have a particularly long-term consequence for the state are population ageing and climate change, which we heard a lot about over the last couple of days. But I also want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity, and particularly how it relates to our elections. In relation to kind of population ageing, we all know, what's happening here. This is a population chart by age group taken from the 2018 Ageing Report, Economic and Budgetary Projections for the EU member states, which is probably marginally more boring than the programme for governments. And the red line is what the population actually looks like at the moment, and the bars are what the population is going to look like in 2070. And it's very gender stereotypes. The blues are the males and the pinks are the females. And we know that the EU population is going to grow up to, we think, about 520 million by 2070. But crucially, the working age population is actually going to fall in that period. And you can see that from this chart. It's the gap between the red line and the bars in the middle age categories. And the strongest population growth, or some of the strongest population growth actually, is going to be in Ireland. So this problem is a little bit further down the road for us, but it is inevitable in the way that demographics are. And as a consequence, it's one of the most predictable problems that we know faces us into the future. Now, one of the great achievements of governments in the last 20 to 30 years in Ireland has actually been around pensioner poverty. We have some of the lowest rates of pensioner poverty in the developed world, and that really is a singular achievement of the public pension. But preserving those achievements is going to be a very complicated chart because of the inevitability of demographics. And the details in the chart, I made this a little bit bigger. We know that the contributions to the public pension system at the moment is about 3.8% of GDP, and that's going to grow to 6% of GDP based on these projections by 2070. Now, I know some of you were here yesterday when Seamus Coffey, my colleague from UCC, was talking, and he was talking about €1 billion being 14 pallets of €50 notes. This is a lot of pallets of €50 notes that we're going to have to find in the meantime. And it means this chap in his €5 notes are just not going to be politically feasible into the future. And the way in which we make policy about pensions and about ageing and planning for the future just isn't going to be practical. So one of the things are feasible or fiscally possible. So one of the things we need to look at in the next programme for government is going to be movement on pensions and movement in relation to how we're going to plan, how we're going to pre-fund these, and how we're going to deal with the unpalatable political nature of turning around and changing the way in which we've actually delivered the pension, particularly when we know that pension policy has been singularly successful in achieving its objectives over a period of time. This chart is from John Fitzgerald, who's sitting here in the audience, just to kind of reinforce the point about climate change. It's one that you put up in the Citizens' Assembly in 2017, and the dotted line is the really important one, which is the kind of the projected way our emissions are going at the moment. And quite obviously, you can see that they're actually meant to be going downhill. I think that when we look at the debates, things like the carbon tax have kind of been priced into the conversations. In fact, a lot of us will be surprised if there isn't movement on the carbon tax later on this year. And we know that there's lots of incentives for retrofitting houses and for electric cars. But really, kind of when it comes to the whites of their eyes on climate change and forming the next government, we need to know what they're going to do on the national herd. And Eamon Ryan is waiting in the wings. And we need to see what the detail is going to be in the Fianna Fáil and the Fine Gael manifestos. How are they going to plan, and how do they suggest they're going to shrink the national herd? Because this is one of the crucial stumbling blocks to the next government. Cybersecurity is one that we don't really hear about, and I don't think it's come up very much this week. And this happens at a couple of levels. Governments have responsibility for managing the digital infrastructure in individual states. We're not really exposed to the kind of risks in Ireland in the way that they are and they have already been in a lot of our kind of fellow European member states, many of whose administrative systems have already been the subject of cyber attack. We're quite behind in terms of understanding the nature of this problem and even seeing kind of the critical role for the government in protecting our digital infrastructure and developing that. We don't have a dedicated agency with full, robust responsibility for this in the way that they do, for example, in other countries like Germany. And very particularly, I kind of want to draw to our attention in relation to the kind of broader theme of the school in relation to the nature of our democracy and particularly the security of our elections. Because we've just come through a set of European Parliament elections where the tone and the focus of the debate was really quite different in a lot of other European member states, many of whom had actually been preparing for many months and had been expecting significant cyber attacks on their elections and significant consequence and impact on their democracies. And this is something there's heightened sensitivity to in a whole load of other countries. And it's kind of ironic that we have the Silicon Docs and some of the biggest players and channels through which this thing actually happens sitting in Dublin along the quays. But we're one of the countries that doesn't really think that this is a very serious issue. And it can come and it can develop in a couple of different ways. Disinformation, we had reports in the Irish Times only about 2 or 3 weeks ago talking about the kind of first serious disinformation attack by the Russians, which had storylines about Northern Ireland that were very improbable, but it fairly clearly linked back directly to the Russians. But we've seen disinformation operate in referendum campaigns. So in the referendum on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, we know that there was a website which said, confused about the abortion debate, check out the actual facts here. Now, we know that was a very one-sided website. This is disinformation. We didn't know who was funding that website. We don't know kind of what its objective was. So we do know that disinformation is a critical problem, but we haven't invested or given thought to how we need to protect our political process from these kinds of attacks and this kind of difficulties that lie ahead. We know that there is potential for abuse of private data, and Cambridge Analytica, very famously, of course, is behind a lot of the micro-targeting scandals, using the information and the data that they can collect about you from your social media profiles and then targeting messages. Now, we're still very unsure in political science research about how effective that actually can be. But the important thing is to remember there's something of a difficulty when people think about, these types of attacks on our electoral processes. Yes, in some countries, the objective is to get one political party or one person elected. But in many instances, the objective of these attacks is simply to breed distrust. It's to erode integrity in the system. So it's not necessarily about pitching one party ahead of another party. It's about causing people to question the integrity of the overall system, because that's what makes the system vulnerable into the future. And our system is very vulnerable because we haven't seen the threats that are coming, and we don't see the potential impact. And we're a little bit cavalier about our democracy in that sense of the word. And I think that cavalier nature comes from the fact, because, as Pat says, the centre has held in Ireland. There isn't a radical right party that's knocking on the door of politics. There isn't the kind of concern and convulsion amongst elites that very significant challenges lie ahead. And that's perhaps led us to be a little bit complacent about our elections, about our democratic process. The EU is talking about moving ahead with kind of steps in this direction, but electoral procedures are a competence of national member states. So whilst the European Union might be able to set down kind of broad parameters, ultimately it will come to us to make the decisions on these kinds of things. So effectively, what I want to kind of finish up by saying is part of the problem with these types of issues is they're not immediately urgent. These are questions of the future. But if we wait until the future to actually begin to deal with these things, it will really be too late to deal with them. And I don't have any answers or really any solutions, but the challenge for us is actually in creating a political environment where future-proofing is politically desirable, where it's electorally rewarding to put policies before the public that speak to 5, 10 and 20 years into the future, and that those are actually returned and rewarded. So I think some of the emphasis on the kind of the structure of the government and how many TDs there are and how big your majority is and whether it's strong and stable government is a little bit misplaced. That we actually really need to look at the institutions and see that those have actually worked very effectively and adaptively within the circumstances. But we need to look and focus an awful lot more on what's on the agenda for the government and what are the key issues they need to be dealing with that are not necessarily those that are the immediate ones right in front of us. Because we've talked a lot of those and they're unlikely to catch us by surprise. It's these other intangibles in the distance that are much more likely to come and catch us and cause us serious problems into the future. Thank you very much.